Okay, it's 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. So it's time for me to welcome you to the Food for Sustainability and Grow webinar on functional biodiversity in the agri-food sector. Today, we have the privilege of hearing insights for esteemed speakers who are at the forefront of this critical topic. Unfortunately, Mariana Gerald just had a last-minute problem. We're not sure if Mariana will join us, but I will introduce briefly Mariana. Mariana, she's the CEO of Nature Bounds and has an extensive expertise in environmental conservation and sustainability, and she eventually will coming to shed some light on the importance of preserving biodiversity in agricultural practices. Joining us next, we have Joana Canelas. Great pleasure that we have our biodiversity specialist here from Food for Sustainability. And Joana will be delving into the intricate relationships between biodiversity and sustainable food production, offering valuable perspectives on how we can integrate biodiversity into our food systems. And we also have the pleasure to be joined by Sergei Schaub. Sergei is a researcher at Agroscope, whose expertise lies in exploring innovative solutions to enhance biodiversity in agriculture. So I please ask you to join me to give a warm welcome to our speakers. Just before we dive into our speaker's presentation, let me briefly touch upon the impact of biodiversity loss in the agri-food sector. So as we all know, biodiversity loss poses significant challenges to agriculture, as we have seen from the previous webinars. Today, we bring to you result-based schemes that aim to incentivize farmers to ecosystem conservation. We look at minimizing the impact of intensification of farming systems and ultimately look towards resilience of our food supply. You know, the challenges are quite big, but with our speakers, we can see there is still hope, namely through artificial intelligence that offers promising avenues for biodiversity monitoring, providing us tools to track and conserve biodiversity in agricultural landscapes. And with that said, let's embark in our discovery journey as we explore the vital role of functional biodiversity in shaping the future of agriculture. And just before we proceed, as usual, let me remind you that these webinars are recorded. Lovely to see your faces, but if you're not comfortable, please just have your camera off. Also, we'll be using Slido or the chat here in Teams for your questions. I will be addressing your questions to our speakers after each speaker presentation, and we will allow time at the end for a more broad questions to all our speakers. So I will invite you all to participate. These webinars are definitely much more interesting when you take part in them and when you join the discussion. As always, before we start, let's do a warm-up. Let's imagine we are entering a paddle game or a football game or a hockey game or a rugby game. Let's warm up. And the team has prepared a couple of questions for us to start getting to the topic of our speakers. How do we do this? We jump on Slido. Slido is fairly easy to use. So if you just open a tab in your browser and you type www.slido.com, you should be able to find the link to Slido. And once you're in, there is a box with an hashtag, and please just insert the code F4S Academy, and you should be in. Once you're in, okay, just giving you some more time to jump on Slido. Once you are in, you will see two tabs, one Q&A and one polls. Q&A is for you to type in your questions while the speakers are speaking, presenting, or even when they finish. We will be paying a lot of attention to your questions. And the warm-up is in polls, right, Rita? What have you prepared for us today?
Let's see.
Let's see. Okay, so the first question, and I think today the questions are a little bit more tricky. Let's see how familiar we are with these topics. So, why is it important for farmers to effectively assess the biodiversity in their lands? Why do you think so? It's because farmers get compensated for implementing the proposed measures. It's because that farmers can increase their biodiversity while at the same time choosing results they want to see in their land? Or is it because they can actually be penalized for not following biodiversity policies? Which one do you think makes more sense? We are voting. Let's see. Okay, this is very important too, that the assessment is effective because it minimizes the risks for farmers and provides transferable and accessible indicators. And one of the things has to be done at a reasonable costs. Sergei has looked into this topic very, very carefully. Sergei, is it because they can get compensated, or is it because they can increase their biodiversity while at the same time choosing the results they want to see?
I
And
actually, ah,
okay, well, I think at this stage it's mainly because they can increase biodiversity, but very importantly is by choosing the results they want to see, and this contributing also to the adoption of results-based schemes. So all of them are a little bit true, but the more correct one is to increase biodiversity while choosing results. Sergei, I'm sure that will shed some more light on this. I told you these questions were going to get tougher. Great. Thanks so much for taking part. Now we're going to delve into a tool that Joana is going to bring to us. That is called the human appropriation of net primary production. And do you know what it does, what it means, and what does it demonstrate? So is it a model to demonstrate how much net primary productivity humans use and take away from plants? So it's how much we are taking from the system. Is it an indicator that gives an idea how the net primary productivity that humans consume through intensive practice? Or is it an indicator that demonstrates the amount of area used at the same time the intensity of land use? Well, while you vote, don't be afraid, these are anonymous questions, so you can vote. This is definitely a prominent measure for the scale of human activities compared to the natural process. It's an indicator that shows how much pressure we are putting in biodiversity. We have a tie. Oh dear, that's really okay. Thanks for the person that has voted. Joana, you can, I know this is your topic, you will explain everything, but the HENF is actually an indicator that demonstrates the amount of area used by humans and the intensity of land use. So touching upon intensive land use and ecological stability. Okay, so thank you so much. So we're really getting into our topic. So we are learning something also here in the warm-up. Rita, I think we can have another one. No? This is always knowledge. There's always an opportunity to learn. So the third question relates to in what way can artificial intelligence help to improve biodiversity in the agri-food sector? So has artificial intelligence actually reached biodiversity? Well, it has because it reduced manual labor involved in collecting and measuring biodiversity data across several platforms. I'm not really sure. I'm not sure if artificial intelligence is really at that level yet. Maybe not, maybe yes. Or is it because it reduced manual labor costs and can use multiple data collection technologies and data sets? So, how can artificial intelligence be of assistance to biodiversity monitoring, to biodiversity conservation? Okay, this one was more consensual, and it's true because it actually decreased labor costs, but can also be used through several data collection technologies and data sets. So, well done. Thank you all for taking part. It was great. I think we have a very good warm up. We are really ready to jump into the topic. So while I call Sergei to the floor, let me give you a little bit background on Sergei. So Sergei works as a postdoctoral research at Agroscope. Agroscope is the Swiss Center of Excellence for Agriculture Research. Before joining Agroscope, Sergei did his PhD and postdoc at ETH Zurich. His area of work focus on two main topics. The first one is the evaluation and design of public policies to promote biodiversity, as well as on farmers' decisions to participate in these agri-environmental programs. The second area relates to the economic assessment of biodiversity as a nature-based solution in agriculture to increase productivity and reduce risk. Sergei's research is characterized by quantitative approach and working across disciplines. So he works also with ecologists, agronomists, environmental scientists, surely economists. So thank you so much, Sergei. I can see that you have your presentation. So the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you all hear me well. So thanks for the invitation. And I also really like the question you proposed before, like why do farmers want to measure biodiversity? And I think many had it right. And I think also it's really important to think about how we can make it interesting, also financially interested to farmer to measure biodiversity, and by that give them an increased incentive to at least not diminish the biodiversity they actually have. And this is also basically what my talk is centered around today. So I will talk about agri-environmental schemes. And here we'll, on the first side, focus on result-based designs. And the second part of my talk will think about if culture can help the participation of farmers in schemes, or what is the cultural driver behind that. But let me first start a bit more in the beginning. So why do we talk about these schemes? We talk about this because agricultural intensification and also land use change really severely threaten our biodiversity and can cause degradation of ecosystems. In response to this now, governments around the globe and a lot of governments in Europe, I would assume basically all, put agri-environmental policies into place to reduce this pressure. And let me put this a bit into perspective for you. So the European Union spent in 2023 about 15.4 billion euros on so-called green measures. So this is a very wide term. And this equates basically to 94 euros per hectare of agricultural land. In Switzerland, where I'm located, this number is even much higher. So here the government spends around 405 euros per hectare of land for so-called green measures. So that's quite a large investment. So we want to make sure that this investment really brings the outcomes we want and also are effective. And one part of these green measures are now paid in so-called agri-environmental schemes. And what are these agri-environmental schemes are? We'll talk in a minute about it. But what is the issue now here? So two important points can be raised here. So we really have a lack of understanding how effective agri-environmental schemes are for the environment. And in general, often the ecological effectiveness is questioned overall. And this is obviously not good, given that we spend a lot of money and that we really want to reduce the pressure on biodiversity and our ecosystems in general. So we really need to address two things here. So first is the design of ecologically effective schemes. And the second part also, we need to understand how we can encourage farmers to participate in effective, meaning here also very ambitious schemes. And I think this is really important to, when talking about encouraging farmers, it's not about having farmers participate in schemes where they get a lot of money or are very low hanging and not ambitious schemes, but really the ambitious scheme we want to ensure participation. And now for both of these parts of these two needs, so to call, I will have a short input on them. I really see my input of today more like as a starting of a discussion rather than diving into depth of my research. So let's start with the first one now. And let's talk first a bit more about how can agri-environmental schemes look like. So on the first hand, we have so-called action-based payments. So there farmers receive money for implementing certain management practices. For example, having a late cut of grasslands, having reduced fertilizer inputs, having a hedgerow, etc., etc. So these are called action-based payments. And what I'm really interested in are the so-called result-based payments. And here farmers receive payments or are at least eligible for payments when they reach certain environmental outcomes or results. And this is usually measured then by some thresholds. Let's say there are a list of indicator species, and if you achieve at least 6 indicator species in Switzerland, you can get these payments. So they're really connected to environmental and biodiversity outcomes. And these result-based payments were in many places really implemented in order to increase the effectiveness of their action-based counterparts, so to speak. So when we talk about the schemes, it's always very important to have a bit in mind what are the advantages and disadvantages. And I want to just highlight a few of them. There are obviously a longer list available. So the advantage with result-based payments is that eventually farmers can be more motivated to participate because they can choose freely, they can actually measure and see biodiversity and compensate it for that. But they are very flexible in how they achieve the outcomes. And that's very interesting. Also, because this allows them to choose cost-effective measures that fit actually their local circumstances. So it's not a one solution fits them all kind of approach, but they actually can use, given their environmental circumstances, the tools to increase and achieve these results. However, there are also disadvantages. One is related to achieving results because farmers might implement certain actions. However, then the environmental outcomes don't result. And this causes a risk for farmers. And I think that's very important, especially when we talk, for example, about mobile species such as birds, because they're sometimes very difficult to connect to certain fields and plots of farmers. So there's a great uncertainty, and you might need to pay farmers more. And there was actually just recently a study published which actually found exactly this, that as the uncertainty of the outcomes increases, you need to pay farmers more to participate in result-based schemes. Then there are eventually higher monitoring costs, and I will talk about this a bit later, how we can address this. And these result-based schemes always require indicators to measure biodiversity. And the reason is because we cannot measure the entirety of biodiversity. It's simply too complex. So we usually rely on indicators to approximate, so to say, biodiversity, and then also to pay farmers. And in a recent study, so published last year, led by Naomi and myself, we looked at these biodiversity indicators for result-based payment schemes in the first step. And then we also looked in a second step a little bit, how can we in the future maybe facilitate the implementation of result-based schemes? And now I really want to just really quickly run through you to the main results. And first, again, highlight what we did in the first step. So we looked at indicators of result-based schemes, which are first proposed in the scientific literature. So what are scientists proposing? And then second, we were also curious what is already implemented in existing result-based schemes, so in practice, so to speak. So very in a nutshell, and there are many more sides to that because it was a review, so I could speak just 50 minutes about that, is that most studies and scheme focus on grasslands and on plant species diversity, and they use different kind of vascular plants, so different herbs, different forages, etc., in order to measure biodiversity. So I think that's one main account, and this is also what you see here. So here are the proposed indicators in the scientific literature, and we see most of them are green, which represents grasslands. When you look at existing schemes, this looks a bit different. However, I think it's important here that especially the large scale schemes often still focus on grasslands, such as in Switzerland and also especially in Germany. Exactly. And I'm happy to dive into more detail. What is also here lasting very interesting. So you have very long and even the first result-based schemes in Europe where they actually paid for wolverines, like I think in Finland this was. So there are single species when they are present, farmers are paid or communities are then usually paid because these are mobile species. And then you need to think about a little bit different how to approach that. And all of this, like coming back to the studies, which proposed result indicators for result-based schemes, they usually thought about how to best approximate biodiversity, but they thought less about how these indicators can most efficiently be linked to payments to farmers. And I think this is an important next steps, and we have currently work in process where we actually find that the payments really trigger changes only at the threshold. So having maybe more thresholds in place might be very valuable. So having not one threshold as we have in Switzerland, but in Germany you have schemes which have, for example, 2 or 3 thresholds. All right, this now to the indicators and results. And now how can we improve the implementation? And if you have questions for clarification, please don't hesitate to also interrupt me during my talk. So how could we implement in the future more advanced result-based schemes? So first of all, we could use modeling. We could use machine learning, for example, to model indicators and results. So having really information, what do farmers do? What are the environmental conditions, etc., and then model what are the potential, for example, biodiversity results. However, this would then not be something what we traditionally understand under result-based schemes, but like a mix of action and result-based schemes. Then more promising and also available in the near future is using digital solutions such as, for example, smartphone apps, where farmers can actually use these apps today, for example, Flora Incognito, to take pictures of plants in their fields and then have them geo-referenced to a specific plot, and then the payments could be triggered by that means. Why is that interesting? It reduces a lot of monitoring costs because right now usually you have experts traveling to the field of farmers. These are then either paid by the government or by farmers themselves, so there are a lot of costs involved. And having just a smartphone app, which also reduces cheating by having geo reference data, would help in these terms. Then you could think about drones. There are many studies looking at that. First of all, how can we actually measure biodiversity with that, but also what would this mean for result-based schemes? And then there's something called eDNA, where you actually use samples from rivers, haystacks, soils, etc., where you can then have a picture of the biodiversity. However, especially eDNA, I think this is something for a bit more more in the future than just like in 5 years. But I think this could be something very interesting to also look at larger scale of biodiversity, and you would also be less dependent on having specific measurements times, because with all the digital solutions, you always depend that flowers are flowering, plants are flowering, etc., to really nicely detect them. And this could be resolved by using eDNA. All right. And this brings me now to my second part of the talk. So this was a very fast run through result-based schemes and what indicators could be used and how could they be implemented. But let's say we have now this perfect result-based scheme. How can we encourage farmers to participate in them? And in a recent study, so also published last year, led by Yang Bing, we looked how if culture drives the participation of farmers. So does culture drive it, and how does it interplay with economic incentives in biodiversity conservation? So we have here biodiversity conservation, then we have culture, which has like leads to an intrinsic motivation of farmers to do certain biodiversity conservation actions. And then we have payments, which have an extrinsic motivation. So these are two main factors which influence people to participate in these schemes and farmers. However, there might be also interacted. So with higher extrinsic motivation, maybe in the role of intrinsic motivation changes, etc. And this is really what we looked at in this study. So what did we do in detail? Here, a very brief run through to get some idea. So we looked at Switzerland. And Switzerland is so interesting because we have different language areas in Switzerland. So we have a German-speaking part. This is the one in red. Then we have the French-speaking part. This is the one in blue. The Italian, the green one, and then the Romanish, the orange one. So these are then connected to different culture because you can use culture as a language as a proxy for culture. This is strongly connected to social relationships and social norms, as well as to forming the social identity, also passing this over generations. What was also interesting for the study, we had information of biodiversity conservation by farmers and payments over time. We observed an increase in payment, so that by that mean we could better understand how extrinsic motivation is linked to intrinsic motivation, as I showed before. And then we focused really on this close area close to the French and German border. And the reason for that is quite straightforward. It is because at this border, the regions are very similar, both in political and environmental systems. We didn't look at the Italian versus the German part, for example, because there is actually a jump in environmental conditions. So we wouldn't assume that they are comparable, while as at this language border, they are actually very nicely to compare. And this is also what other studies have been using in the past. So what did we find? We find in a nutshell that culture matters for people participating in biodiversity conservation behavior. In our case, on the German side, more people participated, which was interesting. However, for me, the most interesting result was actually with higher payments, you could reduce the difference of biodiversity conservation behavior between different cultures. And this has quite some important implications, which is that you can use this information that different cultures behave differently in terms of nature conservation to design more cost-effective measurement schemes. For example, in this case, you might need to pay French farmers more than German farmers. Obviously, in a Swiss system, that's not easy to differentiate payments, but on other levels, you might be able to do that. And this brings me already to my concluding slides. And I think as many people do who work in this field, the first message is we really need to act now. We might not have the perfect schemes yet in place, but really we need actions to conserve biodiversity. Then there is a big push at the European level, at the Swiss level anyways, for having even more result payments than we currently have. However, we really need to understand how we can increase their ecological effectiveness. This means then also what is the optimal policy design here? How can we facilitate implementation, meaning the lowest possible monitoring cost and transaction cost for farmers? Because this is also a reason why many farmers today, I assume, are very unhappy because they get money, but there are so much administrative burdens involved in that process that they can get quite frustrated. And also there's a trust issue sometimes there. And we also want to think how we can design better result-based payments for different system than just grasslands, looking at the farm level. And there are some very interesting examples out there, which I didn't talk about in detail, but such examples exist. So it would be very interesting to understand how effective are they and how they can be also implemented sometimes at larger scales. And then last but not least, we need to really understand how we can encourage farmers to participate in very ambitious schemes, and then also have this participation cost-effective broadly implemented. And that's already the end of my talk. I'm sure I talked a little bit too long, but you told me I have some minutes to spare because we
You
missing
are
one
like a
speaker.
Swiss clock, Sergei. Don't
Perfect.
worry. We can really tell that you are exactly 50 minutes. So thank you so much.
Of course.
It was quite a lot of insights,
Yes.
a lot of knowledge. I don't know if our participants had time to digest, but very interesting work that you're pointing. So also actually doing an assessment of result-based schemes and also the role of culture to the adoption and implementation of such schemes. Very, very interesting. Okay, very focused on Switzerland, but it's already a good starting point. Sergey, I have two questions to kick off the discussion. I know you briefly touched upon this, but how do you think we can leverage the biodiversity indicators, not only to quantify the outcomes, but also, and probably very important also, to incentivize farmers towards a proactive biodiversity conservation practice? What do you think it needs to be prioritized to ensure that we have more proactive farmers to be monitoring this biodiversity indicators?
So I honestly think that you usually need to pay for, like, some farmers are very willing to do something, but as they're always in conflict, they have opportunity costs they need to produce. Usually they have not the highest profit margins, so they really need to think also how they make enough money for themselves. So I think it's really important to then have also a fair compensation for things they deliver. And I understand then sometimes also biodiversity is what they deliver. I think we need to build then trust between policymakers and farmers. I think this is especially currently an issue with a lot of changes in agriculture policy, especially also at the European Union level. I think this is why many farmers became, in the last weeks, months, very frustrated. So we need to build trust here again to also ensure that there are long-term perspective, that they can make certain actions. But on the other side, you really also need to think that we pay for that, and also there are externalities eventually produced which are negative. And I think there's also okay if then there are certain laws restriction in place, but really paying then for people, for farmers, and also having this positioning a farmer as one who produces biodiversity and not just harms biodiversity might actually help in the end. But there are many question marks still open, which needs to be figured out, I assume.
And on that topic, Sergey, one of the things that we start to hear about are biodiversity credits. Um, do you feel that they can be an alternative to these result-based eco schemes, or do you feel that they are kind of the same scheme and with not much difference? What would be the challenges and the advantage that you foresee?
So I'm honestly not an expert on biodiversity credits, but as I understand them, they are very similar. You pay farmers for delivering certain actions with credits. As I understand, you would then transfer this more between different actors, while as with these payments currently in place, you usually have not a transfer that someone else can harm something for that. Or someone else needs to have plus points and needs to buy this from farmers. So I think this is currently not the place. I think there are many people who studied biodiversity offsets, and they often show that given that we have a very slow response of systems, we really need to be careful to say that we can harm biodiversity at one point, place in time, and space also, and compensate this somewhere else, because there's a huge time lag, there's a huge uncertainty included. So this needs to be all factored in to have like then what this community often refers to has a net positive impact,
Mhm.
and really ensure that there is not a disadvantage in the end.
Okay, and we have a comment here in the chat that actually points that we need to be quite considerate about the cost, sorry, I have the chat here. Okay, so quite consider about the cost, and you also mentioned throughout your presentation, and until we don't have the costs of monitoring and measuring at the right level, it's going to make these measures more challenging. And one of the suggestions is also we can credit markets can also be used to involve more players to finance biodiversity conservation. That's Georgette, thank you for that. I believe that's also a good point. So there's quite a lot of things to
Yeah.
still.
So can I
Go
comment
ahead.
quickly on this?
Yeah,
So
yes, sure, sure.
I mean, this is for sure a crucial thing, but this not only, first of all, it not only applies to result-based games, I would postulate, but it also is the case for action-based games where you still need to have some kind of monitoring. However, depending how sophisticated your result-based payment indicator is, so the one you use in these games, it might get quite expensive or more difficult. But there are promising new tools there. And also, I mean, eventually we need to pay something for conserving biodiversity. I think that's not the worst thing, but obviously this needs to have like some cost-effective moment to it and considerations. And yeah, for me, it's really also like currently in Switzerland, for example, farmers need to pay the people who control their fields. So the cost is not with the policymakers, but at least for this part of the controller, it's with the farmers. However, obviously, there's always a huge system behind the whole thing. So there are many costs who will always be at decision makers and policymakers. But yeah, I mean, if there could be more crowdfunding, I would be happy about that.
Yeah, why not? Let's launch a
And I mean,
crowdfunding
yeah,
platform. At least to start
yeah,
piloting some
yeah,
projects and get inspiration for others.
yeah. And then, I mean, at least in Switzerland, but I'm sure you have this also in other countries. There are then labels in place where you, where supermarkets or other producers um, uh, can receive labels for having biodiversity-friendly products. It obviously is also a wide range. There, I haven't seen one which is actually linked to actual results. I think that's always very tricky. Also, it's very difficult to communicate sometimes. But yeah, I'm very curious what people come up with, to be honest. And I'm sure there are people who think much harder about this more crowdfunding ideas than I do. So very interesting discussion.
Yes, it's what marketeers call the credence value of those labels. It's the inability to verify that the claims of these labels actually are protecting biodiversity, or the tuna that we are buying did not use nets that damage other species. But these are the challenges we need to face in order to ensure that the message is across. Also, because I think every single human being would like to preserve biodiversity. We have a couple of questions. Just one more question, Sergei. I really need to bring this up to the webinars. Food for Sustainability looks very attentive to soil microbiology, to soil microbiome. This is one of the core of our activities. We actually we have a laboratory using DNA sequencing of microbiome. But at the EU level, it seems like the policies are trying to use as starting points indicators that are already familiar to farmers. For example, in your presentation, you clearly point that vascular plants are ones of to be the measures of biodiversity indicators. What is the role of microbiology, microbiome in biodiversity monitoring? This is kind of the starting point of the food web. Um, has it come across during your research? Is it something that you think farmers are aware? Could we do more in terms of this preservation also?
So I'm sure farmers are aware. Um, I think farmers know a lot of things, but I'm not sure if they always get credits for preserving it in the best way. And this is also how the market is currently structured, so it's not to their blame. In terms of policies, we have obviously policies in place which like try also with organic agriculture. There is at least the aim to reduce the or maintain soil fertility over a longer time, or even restore it. But like when we come now to result-based payments, I never heard of someone even thinking about that, to include this. And I think this is, it might be also very, very tricky to understand where the thresholds, and the thresholds in general, so far, it's really a normative judgment from what threshold farmers are paid. I think this is a bit, will always be a normative question, but it can be smarter designed than it's currently. And in that sense, it could also be, if there are reliable measures for eDNA, it always needs to be reliable in the end. There could be something which also addresses then soil, etc., or water nitrates. But then it's like, especially if we talk about water bodies, for example, there's always a huge catchment area. So there's not one farmer contributing to this. So we need to go on a community level. With soil, it might still be a bit more local, depending where it's located and what kind of soils we're talking about. So I think it's very interesting, and it's very important to think about this and have creative minds who think about that. And there are people like with the soil issues, like there are studies when I talked before about this modeling approach, where people really start to have a more advanced modeling of the outcomes, and by that trigger payment. So there might be some way in between which is more easy available than having completely measured results, but having really highly predictive, for example, machine learning approaches might be more feasible in the future. But in practice, I haven't seen such yet.
Okay,
But
let's look at it.
one more comment. So often the vascular plants are used in order to somehow also reflect good, healthy soils. So also extensive grassland use, just to comment on that. And now,
It would be the indirect effect of
yeah,
a
exactly.
good functional soil microbiome. Let's look at it like the mobile phone. Okay, it started by being a very chunky piece, only accessible to a niche
Exactly.
market, and nowadays, there's not a single person in the world that almost not that cannot access, and hopefully we will move towards this soil microbiome analysis, also to contribute to biodiversity monitoring. Thank you, Sergei. We had a couple of questions from the audience. Let me just turn there. The first question I think we covered. Thank you so much for that question. We have here a second question. Are these similarities between the schemes and the ecosystem services? Are there similarities between schemes and ecosystem services? Should the evaluation be at the region, climate, agriculture? So what is the level of analysis of these schemes?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if I get the message, unfortunately. Was it posted in
Slido? So basically the level of analysis. I think this is always a big issue.
yeah.
To how can we measure biodiversity, at what level?
That's a good thing. Yeah, we thought about this too when writing the paper, and I think there is always a trade-off between cost effectiveness, so going to a very small scale, and having a very large scale. Obviously, you don't want to compare grasslands in very high mountain regions to the valley in Switzerland. Also, you don't want to compare meadows in Finland, for example, to meadows in Spain. I mean, this comparison really lacks on effectiveness. You want to have a more spatially restricted scheme in place, which takes a bit more the local circumstances into consideration. How small you go, it's very tricky to answer because there are many factors playing in there. There's at some point also, if you go too small, you might set targets too low because your reference points in like a very intensively used valley might be really low, and you should actually aim much higher. So it's very tricky, and we didn't find a very satisfying answer. What is the perfect spatial scale? But that's actually maybe a very interesting question to address in the future. I will write that down.
Mm-hmm. the more and more this result-based schemes get implemented, the more data we'll have of where things work, and try to see if we have, a common approach to be used as at the broadest level possible. Thank you so much, Sergei. I think we need to move on. I ask you to keep here, to stay here with us. I will now call Joana to the floor. Thank you, Joana. Joana has a bachelor in physics. She has a master's in complexity science and a PhD in biodiversity management, which is a branch of geography and human ecology from the University of Kent. Joana was a permaculture technician, and since then she defends an agroecological approach to food system, developing research into social ecological dynamics and impacts of land use on biodiversity and ecosystem services in Portugal, Germany, and the UK. Joana, it's a pleasure to have you here. You have the presentation. Look forward to hear your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia, and also thank you, Sergei, for such an interesting presentation. And yeah, I will contribute now with a bit of modeling that was mentioned. So, and this other side also biodiversity, and why perhaps farmers could should enhance biodiversity also for their own benefit and ecosystem as a whole. So this work is called land use intensity and ecosystem stability. So this is what I'll try to explain a bit this relationship. So yeah. So this is based on the work published in Ecological Modeling in 22. And its objectives are to assess the impacts of land use intensity. In particular, we're going to speak about harvest of net primary production on ecosystem stability. Ecosystem stability here has three main aspects. So local stability, biomass variability, and the species persistence. So it means species extinctions or not. And on the other side, also to assess this impact on the ecosystem function. So what's the supply of provisioning services in terms of yields, for example? So I leave here some rhetoric questions for now. One is, what is land use intensity? So this can have many different perspectives on how can we measure land use intensity. And on the other side, what is ecosystem stability? This is also a huge debate, and there's many different metrics one can use to assess stability. And then, like, why does it matter, right? So why does it matter to have some certain type of stability on ecosystems? And how does it relate with diversity? And in particular, so another way to put this question is, what is the role of biodiversity in all of this? Yeah, just to say, I will leave these questions open for now, and I will mostly try to define some concepts here. So starting by land use intensity. So in this work, I could use other definitions, but in this work, I used the human appropriation of net primary production as something that is kind of easily measured. So the HANPP, as we spoke before in the Slido, this is defined as the harvests, so the amount of biomass taken by humans through harvest, but also, so plus the amount of biomass that was removed from ecosystems through land use change. This could be, for example, a conversion from forest to grassland. So we can imagine as this graph here on the side. So there is a potential natural vegetation. So that would be the potential NPP. So just as if it was a natural ecosystem and no human impact. And then we take some from this land use change and some from the harvest, and something remains. So in total, nowadays, there's estimates that humans appropriate about 25% at least of the global potential net primary production. And this figure is over 40% just in Europe. Well, this is tightly related as well, that croplands and pastures cover around 40% of global land surface. And to have some more figures here, so land use change here accounts for about 20% of the global potential net primary production. And it equates to about 40% of this global human appropriation of primary production. The harvest here, as humans take over or around 30% of the global above ground net primary production. So this actual biomass that there is, and this more or less represents about 60% of the human appropriation. So 40% goes for land use change and 60% goes for the harvest itself in terms of what humans take from ecosystems in terms of biomass. Just in past 100 years, we doubled these figures, so from 13% to 25%. This is linked to human impacts in hydrological cycles, ecosystems, carbon, and nutrient flows. And nowadays, land use intensity actually may predict biodiversity patterns as well as environmental factors. So this is some measure of how relevant this can be to understand biodiversity. So this is no news, I guess, to any of us. So land use change and intensification are major drivers of habitat loss, biodiversity change, but also soil and water degradation, as well as declines in ecosystem services, from food production to climate and pest regulation. Of course, these are all metrics that are quite interrelated. And from the point of view of the HNPP, so the human appropriation of biomass, there's a general relationship that one can make, that is, as more biomass there is, more resources there is available in ecosystems. So we could predict, at least theoretically, a higher number of species. This is called the species energy relationship. Now let's look a bit at ecosystem stability. So this relation between ecological complexity and stability has been highly debated. It's not straightforward. And there's been historically a shift in focus also from maintaining stability per se to actually try to embrace ecological change. And most important, avoid regime shifts. Regime shifts are like sudden catastrophic changes. So that's what we try to avoid. And as most of you, I believe, are familiarized with this ecological network, so this kind of graph where we show the interactions of very different species and also biophysical landscape characteristics, for example, and the sun and everything. So we could define ecological complexity as a high number of elements with a high number of connections. So this type of interactions. This usually means that it's very hard to predict dynamics. So there's many elements, they all interact with each other and becomes really hard to know what's going to happen if there is a disturbance or something. On the other side, ecological stability is multidimensional. So it can be understood as local stability, which is more of a mathematical definition, but then also terms like very common nowadays, such as resilience, for example, but also resistance, robustness, variability, and persistence. Here, I will focus on local stability through ecological network model, but also robustness and persistence as two sides of the same coin, let's say. So persistence in terms of species persistence, so no extinctions, and robustness as the structural stability. So the ecosystem is able to keep the species there. And then variability in terms of biomass variability. So in terms of population's density, does this vary widely or they keep more or less the same? So is this metrics of stability I'm going to be speaking about. And just to be explain a bit further these concepts, here in this graph, the stable equilibrium declines with species richness was a work from May 1972. And he shows that as more species there is in the ecosystem, equilibrium seems to decline. Don't be scared. it's not just like this. There's more to it. But this is what triggered a huge debate about it. So why does such a complexity persist in nature? But it's important to see what to actually look at when we think about local stability. So local stability is, we can imagine, so these curves here, and along the x-axis, we have different ecosystem states. And as, for example, let's imagine one valley is here forest, and the other valley is, for example, a grassland. And the ecosystem can change from one to the other, given it has an input of energy enough to actually do it, be it grazing, for example, or overgrazing. But local stability here means that this point here, when if the ball is the ecosystem and is down the valley, it's in a stable equilibrium. Even if there is a disturbance and moves the ball a bit to the sides and happen down the valley, it will bounce back to the same position. The same doesn't happen when there is an unstable equilibrium, as if it is right in the middle between being a grassland or a forest, it is unlikely that will stay there for long. A slightly disturbance will move it either to the one side or to the other, where it will most likely remain for longer. Then in terms of resilience and resistance, this, just to keep our concepts clear, is as if the shape of this valley. So resilience here is how much the ball here, our ecosystem, can bounce back and forth and come back to the same place. And the resistance here would be the amount, so the amount of energy it actually would be required to change state. This change of state is what we would call a regime shift. So it is kind of sudden. Everything seems fine, and suddenly it might jump from one side to the other and can be quite difficult to bounce back. As we can see here, the shapes can vary on this state. Some might be more profound valleys and some others a bit more shallow. And so it might be quite costly to revert back. So yeah, please then let me know if you have any doubts on this. I'll move now to the model itself. So here, what I did was an ecological network model. I will skip the equations, but just to let you know that has two trophic levels. So one consumers, which can be herbivores, for example, and the base level of primary producers. So vegetation, plants. And we consider two types of interactions. One is competition. So for example, based on the idea of similarity, if two species are too similar, they might compete for the same resources. And on the other side, we considered also trophic interactions. So, and this was based on the niche model. So species will have preferred diets and they will feed on what they like most, let's say. The dynamics were modeled based on the Lotka-Volterra model, so it's a very common model for ecological dynamics. It's based on a logistic growth, which means like species will their densities, the population density will grow, but will not grow infinitely. They will grow up to a carrying capacity, the ability of ecosystem to keep those species alive, and a discrete dynamics. This is also not continuous. There's a seasonal growth and a seasonal harvest. With the input was what was defined prior was the number of species and a certain number of connections. How highly connected is this network will be. And our output is a population's density. And then we introduced harvest based on a certain number of species harvested and a certain proportion of biomass harvested. This model may generally represent agroecological systems from croplands to pastures or agroforestry, where here grazing could be considered harvesting by livestock, for example, as defined by stocking rate and livestock diet. And we generated ecological communities with different species richness between 3 and 13 species and about 1,000 sample networks for each. And just looking a bit further into the harvests, I wanted to try the hypothesis that a biomimetic harvest could have lower impacts. But here we define different sets of species harvested that could represent monocultures or polycultures, for example, with also different sets of harvest proportions, so with low biomass or high biomass in different types of ecosystems, so with many species or with a low biodiversity. And tried to test this biomimetic hypothesis by considering also by defining biomimetic harvest as a diverse diet in a diverse ecosystem and see if that would have higher or lower impacts. So these results could apply, for example, for monocultures when just one species were harvested, to polycultures when with more than one species, with or without other species, where we might consider weeds or other. We are not considering here the use of herbicides or pesticides or other chemical, which we just focus on this intensity of land use in terms of the harvest. And now I will show you some of these results. So here is the results in terms of that local stability. And we can see that the number of stable communities decreases steeply with the harvest intensity. So here is the harvest intensity in the x-axis. And also we see that communities with high species richness have lower stability. This is similar to the result that May got in 1972. But also we see that actually, despite that, when we harvest all species, this is a system which remains stable until much further down into the harvest intensity. And then we look at the other metrics of stability. So in terms of biomass variability, what we have here we have that this variability, again, increases with harvest intensity, so we are losing stability. And at the same time, we see that the communities which have higher species richness actually have higher stability, which means lower variability. So these are here in red and in the light blue. And again, we see that if we have an homogeneous harvest distribution, so if you harvest like from different species and not just focus on one, this is when we get the better result, let's say. So this is where we get lower variability for a wider range of harvest intensities. In terms of the species persistence, here we have assessed this in terms of the proportion. So here the bar graphs is the proportion of communities actually suffering extinctions And the line graph is the proportion of species actually going extinct. So we see that for the cases where all species are harvested, when we say all species are harvested, I'm only speaking about the primary producers. So I'm always speaking about vegetation, just to be clear. But this is when, so just at very high harvest intensities, these communities actually have, suffer a high number of extinctions. And also we can see that, again, the species persistence in general decreases with the harvest intensity. So as higher the harvest, as lower the stability. And the communities with higher species richness, again, have higher robustness. So it's this bar chart. But also here, they only have, they only start to suffer extinctions at higher harvest rates, but also they only start to, the number of species that actually go extinct are much lower. So the threatened species are much less. And again, this homogeneous harvest distribution, if we harvest evenly several species instead of just one, is when we get and higher persistence, basically. So is this two here? I know this graph will take a bit visually a bit longer to to read all the information here, but I'll move on still. And just to show you the final result, that is in terms of then what is the impact on also on the yields. And here we see that actually the mean total yields are higher for the intermediate harvest intensities. So instead of harvest everything there is, if we keep something in the fields, and also that these yields are higher for communities with higher richness and those that have a homogeneous harvest distribution. So not focusing just on one, but actually more in terms of polycultures, considering this. And in these cases, which is this higher curves here, both for higher richness or lower richness, these are the cases which have lower yield uncertainty as well. So when you just harvest one species, the uncertainty is much higher in terms of the variability on those yields. Of course, this is a model, so it's a theoretical. In real life, this is how do you say, can be managed and artificially managed to select those. But in terms of the general functioning of an ecosystem, what we can expect is this. And so to conclude, what we take from here is that increasing land use intensity drives a decrease in all metrics of ecological stability, but also on productivity. And the severity of these ecological impacts actually depends on the species richness. So if the ecosystem of higher richness is more robust and more stable and can cope better with these disturbances, and also depends on the harvest distribution. So if we actually distribute our yields from several species, so not focusing just on one, there's lower ecological impacts. So based on this, we could say that more biodiverse agricultural systems and even harvest distributions, so polycultures, may support ecosystem stability, increase the total yields, and actually reduce their uncertainty. So this is it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joana. Thank you so much for your insights. So the question now is, Joana, can we really achieve the sustainable intensification of farming systems? Is it possible? Does your model allow to that the more intensive systems, probably with some not to the full scale of intensification, is it possible possible that we continue to have intervals, but in a more sustainable way?
I would get back to this question that matters in terms of what we consider that is land use intensity. I think this last graph, where actually yields are higher at intermediate scales, and we leave something for the ecosystems itself, can be a good picture to keep in mind. We cannot take everything for humans. We have to actually share it with ecosystems, as there is this interdependence. And at this level also, we can reduce drastically, at least theoretically, these impacts in terms of stability and the capacity of ecosystems to bounce back. So I would say that if sustainable intensification is this, yes. If it is the same dynamic where we take most of everything, leave nothing, then that's not sustainable.
Okay, so definitely there is also scope, and as we've been seeing in the past webinars, like using some biodiversity fences and be careful about crop rotations and polycultures, as you mentioned. That will also lead to more homogeneous harvesting. So probably we are also touching in some of the indicators that you pointed that can lead to more ecological stability. So definitely we have a point there that we can achieve.
Actually, yeah.
Joana, let me turn to our... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to say one thing, that's as well, if this intensification actually means more polycultures and more diverse agricultural systems, then it would make all the sense.
Okay, that's definitely a very good point to bear in mind. Joana, let me turn to our participants. So we have a question. Does your model cover soil biodiversity?
No, it doesn't. It's just above ground, mostly. But it's, no, soil biodiversity. So we could apply it for different scales. So in terms of those trophic levels, would be a matter of those interactions.
Okay.
How do we consider them? So if there are trophic interactions with the vegetation, for example.
Okay, it's a question of starting to factor in more factors into the model, and to turn the model even more complex, to go to below the ground biodiversity. And we are really dying to know more about what's happening below our feet. Thank you, Joana. Another interesting question. Is it possible to use your ecological model to help us in the definition of metrics for agri-environmental schemes?
I think that would be very interesting. I mean, in an improved model, in the sense of, perhaps considering, more realistic ecosystems. This is a very general model, but it could be used to try to, to be adapted to certain regions, for example, and inform. So basically, these models are used to understand ecosystems complexity and also try to predict those dynamics. They are not a realistic picture of ecosystems, but they give clues into where this tipping point might be, for example, in terms of stability. So to apply it in real life, we'll have to input more real data, at least.
Okay, we would need to have farmers buy in also to support the development of the model. Joana, you have shown during your
not
presentation...
necessarily, Claudia. I think this could be done at higher scales, actually. It could more easily be done at regional scales, for example. So not at so much necessarily at the farm scale directly, because much of biodiversity moves around. So
That's why
I think it
Sergei
makes sense.
proposed the vascular plants. They don't move. Fortunately for us, because otherwise.
But their seeds does. Their seeds do.
Okay, that's definitely interesting to look more at a regional level, which is something also relevant for farmers, and to get these more uniform indicators and comparisons even across the regions. Joana, you mentioned something interesting in your presentation. You were talking about the different ecological equilibrium that you could have with the bowl. Very, very nice, that very visual. But some claim that the ecosystems where human interferes, they reorganize themselves and they create a new equilibrium that is formed, even if it's not the original equilibrium, and eventually, if it is not a desirable ecosystem, in terms of ecosystem functions. Do you agree with this? And do you see that what can be the downsides of this new equilibrium that eventually comes out from very intensive land use?
I think it's true that if nature is good at something, is it adapting. So it's very versatile. And so biodiversity, that's also why in this stability debate, for ecosystem stability debate, to shift focus to embrace change, actually, because change is crucial for this adaptation. And this definitely is something that ecosystems are great at doing. And the best we can do is actually support nature doing that adaptation. And that is done through biodiversity as well, which is keeping options open so that there is more options. And so different system states is what I mean. So different states ecosystem can have. In terms of the land use intensity, I think the problem here is that how land use intensity actually decreases biodiversity so steeply. So actually, in the desert, is very much harder to actually bounce back to a forest than it is for a forest to bounce back to bounce to a desert. So this was actually one thing that happened with the Sahara. Sahara's was once a desert, a forest. Now is a desert. And this is something that we need to keep in mind on that. So keeping options, or in terms of keeping high biodiversity, is really important for that adaptation process to happen.
Yes, and that's a
Not
very
so
good
much to
point.
keep it the same.
Yeah, and that's a very good point here from the south of Portugal, where our ecosystems are also facing quite severe desertification threats.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Joana. Now I
Thank
saw
you.
Sergei nodding while Joana was talking. And as we wrap up today's Insight discussion on agri-environmental schemes and land use intensity, it's clear that both of these areas are critical for sustainable agriculture. So a question for both of you. How do you envision the future of farming, where on one hand, agri-environmental schemes are not only designed to protect ecosystems, but also actively integrate the considerations for managing land use intensity. So how can we combine here these two approaches? Sergey, do you want to start? Joana needs a pause now.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a very good answer right now to the question, to be honest.
Sergey, we cannot hear you very clearly.
Sorry.
Yeah, your mic.
Much better.
I'm not sure I have a very good answer to this, to be quite honest. So, I mean, in general, I think with there needs to be a sustainable use of land, but it also means that we somehow need to spare land, which is still available and very rich in species. I'm a big grassland person, so I also would say that especially like semi-natural habitats and semi-natural grasslands are very important to maintain. Having then also talking about the current CAP reform, then also to have maybe there's in German called Brachen, so the set aside land really activated, because this is can be very important to like keep a safe environment. Safe environment is maybe not the best, but like being a rescue for species and like keeping biodiversity at least some space. I think that's very important to have like a more integrated system, so to say. But it also really depends on our food consumption. I think this is many questions will come down to what we consume and how we want to preserve this, our nature and our environment. So I think this is linked, and I think farmers are not the one to blame, but this is like a whole integrative system where also consumers need to do their fair share.
Mm-hmm. It's the agri-food system, so all the stakeholders that are involved, and definitely consumers and retailers, policymakers, farmers, of course, researchers. We all have a role to play. Joana, any final considerations on how we can protect ecosystems, but while still maintaining productivity or achieving a better balance between productivity and biodiversity conservation?
Yeah, I think getting back to your question before, the future of food, and also what Sergei just said, there is this debate as well about land sparing or land sharing, right? So can we actually achieve both objectives in one same place? Can we actually have a food production that is biodiversity friendly? Or do we really want to actually split that as human environment, as if it is separate from all the rest of the ecosystems, and keep nature in like a natural park in a sense, you know? I defend the first option, actually. I think there is no agriculture that can be sustainable if it's not a land sharing, if it's not able to actually share it with biodiversity. And I think that biodiversity is really helpful as well for agriculture itself, as soil biodiversity, for example, but also, I don't know, all biodiversity, as I know, we need to share the resources we've got, and we need to create there some balances. But what I mean is biodiversity can really enhance many ecosystem services. So in terms of pest regulation, for example, and also in terms of water retention. And I think, gladly, I think we're getting closer to understand that. And so, yeah, what I would envision is that sharing, that we can achieve both things in one place. And yeah.
And I think,
achieve
Joana,
a
that's
balance.
yes, that's what we have been discussing throughout this webinar cycle. So we started to look at measures that can be integrated throughout the farming systems in our first webinar, and then we move into the some of the roles that biodiversity have in assisting in terms of pest control and productivities. And now here we touched on result-based schemes and ways to incentivize this biodiversity conservation, bearing in mind that the intensification of land use also has the consequence, but it's possible to manage always if we have biodiversity at the forefront of our talks. And it came through a very interesting example from the Netherlands, I believe, that farmers that started a movement through promoting biodiversity with biodiverse fences, and how everything was so beautiful, and how everyone wanted to enroll in the scheme and to bring all that functionality, but at the same time all the beauty into the system, and while also achieving also more productivity. Well, this is the end of our functional biodiversity webinar cycle. I have to say it was really a pleasure to moderate this webinar. It's a passion topic, quite a lot of interesting questions, interesting topics. I think we have plenty of things to do, but we can see that we are on the right track. It might take slightly longer than we expect, but we need to respect also the rhythms of nature and try to understand them. It has been a pleasure to have you here. I hope that you have enjoyed. Special thanks also to our speakers in this webinar and to all webinars, of course, our participants. We will do a pause for Easter. Okay, we'll be back in the first Thursday after Easter. We will change topic. We will start with the precision agriculture. Let's look how the digital tools and drones and satellites and robots can now be of assistance of sustainability. So thank you so much. I wish you all a very good Easter, and we'll be back on the 4th of April. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.